はローソンのロッピーで予約することなのだ。今回はポケットモンスタークリスタルバージョンなのだ。
さあみんなロッピーへゴーゴーゴー。
Released on the Gameboy Color in 2001, Pokémon Crystal sought to set itself apart from its predecessors. A new story involving the legendary Pokémon Suicune would set the tone for years to come. But was this game actually an improvement on Pokémon Gold and Silver? Let's find out. Welcome folks, I'm Livid. Today I'll be talking about Pokémon Crystal and discussing what it added or changed to the second generation Pokémon games, Gold and Silver. This won't be a top-down explanation of the entire second generation experience, as I've already made a video on that. Check it out if you're not familiar with those games. I do have a bias when speaking about Generation 2 of Pokemon. These are my favorite games of the series outside of their remakes. I remember the day I got it. My mom and I went to Toys R Us on release day, and it was just jam-packed with kids and adults picking up the game. When I was in the checkout aisle, the clerk took the game, rang it up, and he hyped me up by talking to my mom and saying, "Oh, he's gonna love it. We've been selling these games like crazy." And it was true, I did love it. Whenever I get the itch to play Generation 2 of Pokemon, I almost always choose Crystal. I'm hoping today's video will be informative and explain why I think Pokemon Crystal was a worthy addition to the series. Before you choose your starter, you need to have a player character. There was now a new, groundbreaking choice to make before the games even started: the invention of women. That's right, all previous main series games were male main characters. Pokemon Crystal would be the first time you could choose a girl. There are canon names and characters. This girl's name is Chris in Pokemon Crystal. But from a casual perspective, whether you're a kid or an adult, you typically name the character after yourself. Adding a female option was a no-brainer because it's supposed to be your experience and your choices guide the gameplay. It would make sense that you're also given the choice on male and female. While the gaming space is typically majority male, I mean, look at my male to female ratio as someone who talks about video games. Pokemon was different. I'm not sure about your personal experience, but as someone who was there from the beginning, Pokemon was one of those franchises that seemed to have cracked the code as far as gender went. I remember just as many girls playing and talking about Pokemon as the boys in my neighborhood and at school. There is nothing these companies wanted more than to have just as many female gamers as they had male. They still try hard to do it to this day. From a company perspective, it could nearly double your profits. Pokemon Crystal starts off very much like its predecessors, Gold and Silver. Unlike Pokemon Yellow, which removed the option of picking your starter in favor of using a Pikachu, Pokemon Crystal kept the 3 starters. This seems simple and even logical, but even if you look at Pokemon in retrospect, you must acknowledge that Pokemon's first generation games, Red, Blue, and Yellow, set the tone for many things to this very day. Whether you like Generation 1 or think it's overrated, there is no argument it did heavily influence and continues to influence the core series Pokemon games. The usage of a starter at all, gym badges, party slots, rivals, you get the idea. Since Pokemon Crystal was the follow-up game to the previous duo, the devs could have taken the route that Pokemon Yellow did. They could have given you a specific Pokemon they wanted you to use. For example, they could have given you an Eevee, and it kinda would have made sense. Eevee can still evolve into 3 different Pokemon, giving you options. But more importantly, Pokemon's second generation added a day and night cycle. With this cycle, they intertwined 2 new evolutions into this mechanic, Umbreon and Espeon. The devs could have easily taken the choice that would be made much later in Pokemon Let's Go Eevee or even Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. But they stuck with the original 3 starters from Gold and Silver. I'm really happy they did this. It set up Crystal as a game that is still letting you choose your own path. The original 3 choices you are given are varied and unique to each other in typings, design, and stats. This also means the early stages of the game and which Pokemon you choose can start immediately rather than later when you have already been catching Pokemon and adding them to your team. By far the most important change to me was Pokemon coming alive. For the first time in the handheld core series games, the front-facing sprites actually had movement when you encountered them. Hardware limitations didn't exactly give the devs a lot of room to work with in the first couple of games. By the time Pokemon Crystal was released, Game Freak took the great leap. I cannot stress enough how important and revolutionary this was for the time. If you're younger than a millennial, I get it. You may scoff at this. What's the big deal? You should expect it. For us, it was like seeing the first ever recorded film or something. It went from pictures to real life movement. Some of the oldest films ever are from the 1880s, and they look like this. Then one day, a man from the big city comes in and casually shows you this. If that would have happened, they would have all had heart attacks. Their brains wouldn't have been able to comprehend it. Pokemon sprites had already come a long way since the first generation games. They looked great in Gold and Silver. They even looked great in Yellow. But the addition of a very short animation added so much personality to these little sprites. Sometimes it was cute, other times it was intimidating or cool. Either way, life was breathed into Pokemon for the first time in the handheld games. I keep making the distinction with handheld because we did have Pokemon Stadium, which had fully 3D models, but come on, that was on the supercomputer that was the N64. You'd expect it from that. You didn't expect it from the simple and innocent Game Boy Color. My favorite animation was Typhlosion's because the pulsing fire on its back is badass. It shows how its anatomy works and that the flames can grow larger when it's ready for action. Even small details can be enough, especially at that time. And you know what's crazy? Sprite animations would go away in the follow-up games and not return again until Pokemon Emerald in 2004. Pokemon would yet again be cast into a frozen stasis for 3 more years. While I don't see much benefit in that from an experience standpoint, it oddly serves to further show why Crystal was awesome. For a couple of years, if you wanted to go back to seeing animated sprites, Crystal was your only option. Outside of my personal preference with animations, one of the major changes is the additional story elements involving Suicune. Suicune is one of the 3 legendary beast Pokemon from Gold and Silver, which has been given the main stage in these games, hence why it is now the box legendary on the cover. A new character known as Suicune is obsessed with Suicune and has been tracking it for 10 years. If you didn't notice already, Suicune is an anagram of Suicune. I actually never knew how to say this guy's name until writing the script of this video. I had to look it up. Apparently it's Suicune. In Crystal, there isn't much more to his character other than that he really likes Suicune and is determined to encounter it. Similar to your rival Silver, Suicune won't get much added lore until the later remakes of Generation 2 games. Early on in the game, you encounter Suicune in the Burned Tower along with Raikou and Entei. But Suicune seems to take an interest in the player, which means Suicune takes an interest in you. Speaking of Raikou, it was actually redesigned for Pokemon Crystal because it looked way too different than it was intended from the original art. You'll encounter Suicune from then on, who will challenge you to battles because he believes it will gain him favor with Suicune since it takes interest in you. Eventually, you're trusted by the wise trio who will give you the clear bell and will allow you to battle Suicune and catch it in the Tin Tower. All of this is a change to how Gold and Silver was. Suicune is part of the roaming beast Pokemon trio. This means all 3 had to be tracked down in the wild and would try to escape from battle if you didn't have the means to keep them there until it was caught. Suicune doesn't roam in this game, as it kind of takes the place of Ho-Oh or Lugia as the first available static legendary Pokemon you can catch early on. The decision to make Suicune a static encounter rather than having to chase it is also fine. If you would have had to chase it to progress the story, I think it would have ruined the pace of the game and frustrated players. Roaming Pokemon can be difficult to catch, but they weren't tied to the story progression. But the other 2 beasts are still roaming and you're further incentivized to catch them because you'll need all 3 in order to catch Ho-Oh to appear and be caught. Ho-Oh is seen as the leader of the legendary beast trio, as it is said to have been the one that revived them when they passed away in the Burning Tower when they were normal Pokemon. After catching all 3 beast Pokemon, Ho-Oh sees that you're worthy of its return and will battle you. These changes weren't just a good story addition, it actually added good gameplay. I mentioned earlier that you weren't forced to catch the roaming Pokemon in Gold and Silver, and you still aren't forced to in Crystal. But if you want to catch Ho-Oh, you'll need all 3. This means you'll have to interact with the roaming mechanic as you chase them across the Johto region, but also you'll learn how to trap them in battle using moves like Mean Look or Hypnosis. This is a merit-based system that I personally enjoy a lot. You really have to earn it to catch these Pokemon, and it feels extremely intense when you finally catch up to one and there is a chance that your Pokemon won't be fast enough to use a move that traps them in battle. Once you get through the daunting task of getting them, you can finally get Ho-Oh. It's all optional and it feels like a great reward that separates itself from just being what you naturally encounter in Pokemon Gold version. Giving these changes with Suicune to the story, both Ho-Oh and Lugia aren't actually obtainable until the post-game, which is another decision I actually like. It gives you more things to do towards the end of the game as more room is made for the new additions in Crystal. The decision to have the story be tied to Suicune would actually set the tone for all the future games after this. From here on out, almost every Pokemon Core Series game had its box legendary integral to its story. In Generation 1, you could finish the game without ever battling the legendaries. In Gold and Silver, it had Ho-Oh and Lugia, but they weren't intertwined with the story. That all changes with Pokemon Crystal. The ruins of Alph have been given much more attention in Crystal than in Gold and Silver. The ruins of Alph are a mysterious ruin where the Pokemon unknown lurk. They have the appearance of Latin characters and sometimes form words when bundled together that you can decipher. I actually didn't mention the ruins of Alph in my Gold and Silver video despite it being there in those games. That wasn't an oversight. I always felt it was a cool location, but really not fleshed out and kind of forgettable in my opinion. But Pokemon Crystal remedies that issue. It increases the variation of unknown encounters. It adds an entire subplot where where you solve puzzles modeled after ancient Pokemon which will reveal cryptic messages left by the unknown. These messages hint at an ancient civilization that actually made the ruins of Alph. They even hint that the architecture in these very caves are all created by that civilization. This made the ruins of Alph experience totally different and worth investigating. Learning more about the Pokemon world, both current and in the past, really fleshes out the lore. As with many Pokemon games, there are version exclusives or Pokemon moved around to make them more accessible. Gligar and Skarmory were each exclusive to either Gold or Silver, but both can be found in Crystal. Although, this is at the sacrifice of a Pokemon like Mareep, which cannot be caught at all in Pokemon Crystal. Sneasel can now be caught in the Ice Path instead of Mount Silver, which is basically the end of the game. And again, we had to give a sacrifice for this. Magmar was removed from the Burn Tower and replaces Sneasel at Mount Silver. Okay, that one makes me mad. Magmar in the Burn Tower makes too much sense, and there is already a lack of fire Pokemon in these games at this point if you didn't choose a fire starter. I don't think it needed to be moved as a balancing act for Sneasel. Mass outbreaks were a feature in Gold and Silver where a friend of yours would call you to tell you about rare Pokemon appearing in the wild for a short time. These outbreaks were usually the only way you could catch these Pokemon, so it was something you had to do if you wanted to find them. In Pokemon Crystal, these exclusive outbreak Pokemon like Yanma, Dunsparce, and Quillfish are made available in the wild like most other Pokemon. While I have no proof of this, I think the whole number collecting thing wasn't the most popular feature from a gameplay perspective, which is why I believe Game Freak reeled it back in Pokemon Crystal. It could be really annoying being interrupted just to be told useless information like how cool he thinks his shorts are. It wasn't all useless information. Sometimes they were telling you about an outbreak, wanted a rematch for extra experience, or something being sold at the store for a good deal. But yeah, sometimes they didn't give you any pertinent information, and that probably sticks in the mind more than useful information does. An odd egg is given by the daycare couple, which contains one of the 7 new baby Pokemon, and it has a 14% chance to be a shiny Pokemon. 14% is outrageously good odds. If you ever want to go back and play Crystal, this won't take long at all if you'd like to shiny hunt it. Just make sure you save before getting the egg from the old man. It's when he gives you the egg that the rolls are made of which Pokemon it is and if it's shiny or not. So if it hatches and it's not shiny, reset your game, turn it back on, grab the egg again, and keep walking around until it hatches to find out. I do this myself until I get a shiny and just take whatever's given to me. I always try to go for Elekid or Magby because they're just cool and I like their typings. During the events in the Dragon Den, there's a new building you can enter where mysterious dragon soothsayers are hanging out and will ask you a series of questions. If you answer in a very specific way, which can be easily Googled, you can get a Dratini with extreme speed. That move is really good on it and it will take priority in battle. You get a Dratini either way, but you need to answer the questions correctly in order to get the move as well. Crystal had the first ever Battle Tower, a concept that would return in the future third games of each generation. The Battle Tower was meant to guide players into thinking more competitively. In fact, the Battle Tower was even going to have you play against other real trainers. But we'll talk about that later. When you get there, you're given some restrictions so the playing field is all leveled out. There are level caps in groups of 10, so level 10, 20, 30, and so on. Your Pokemon can be underleveled, but they can't exceed these levels. You cannot use Ho-Oh, Lugia, Mewtwo, Mew, or Celebi unless the level cap you've chosen is 70 or higher. You choose 3 Pokemon and battle a series of 7 trainers in a row. These 3 Pokemon cannot be the same. Trainers like Claire and Lance, who insist on using 3 of the same Dragon-type Pokemon, lose their entire meta here. You can't use items from your bag, but you can have hold items on your Pokemon like leftovers. But this means so can your opponents, something that is almost non-existent from your opponents outside of the Battle Tower. You cannot switch out your Pokemon as a free swap when your opponent's Pokemon dies. Oh, and your opponents have a chance of having legendaries themselves. These trainers are not pushovers. They use good Pokemon with good moves and good stats. The prizes for beating 7 in a row are really underwhelming in my opinion. They're just stat boosting items. Now these items are good, they permanently boost the stats of your Pokemon. But the thing is, you can find these in the overworld and even buy them from stores. I think it would have made a lot more sense to have the hold items as prizes instead, since that's really the difference maker in these battles and they're notoriously hard to get in regular gameplay. This is due to their scarcity or being mystery gifts, which are random and sometimes require other players to aid you, which was already hard at the time and is virtually impossible now. The Battle Tower is fun if you want to challenge yourself, but it's not where you get the really good items or accolades. I think it was a great introduction for people who are into the competitive aspects and introduces those concepts to you in an easily consumable way. The trainers are more difficult than the ones outside of the tower, but they aren't as good as competitive human players. It's a nice, isolated way to see what competitive battling would be like. We've talked a lot about what was added, but there was a major feature we did not get in the West that was on the Japanese version of Pokemon Crystal.
Gameboy Color.
子供たちにも新しいゲームの世界にチャレンジさせたい。 モバイルアダプタ GB 誕生。ポケモンクリスタルの世界がパワーアップ。お求めはご覧のお店で。サインボール当たります。
Pokemon Crystal was a flagship game for online compatibility using the mobile Game Boy adapter, which was a peripheral for the Game Boy Color, Advance, and SP. It would connect from your Game Boy to your cell phone. Nintendo and Konami jointly owned a company called Mobile 21, which had an emphasis on using online features to push the gaming industry into the internet era. With Mobile 21 providing service, you'd be able to trade and battle people all over the world, or at least in Japan in this case. You'd even get access to downloadable events. Yeah, I know. The GS Ball, which in the West was famous in the Pokemon animated series, would be downloaded from the service and inspected by Kurt. After a day of inspection, you get the GS Ball back and take it to the Ilex Forest to encounter the mythical Pokemon, Celebi. Downloadable content on the Game Boy Color in 2001. I kid you not. In the Japanese version, the aforementioned Battle Tower would not even be accessible unless you had this peripheral, as they tied the entire tower to the online features in the Japanese version. In their version, that's where you would go to battle real trainers. Even the odd egg I told you about earlier, where you could possibly get a shiny Pokemon, was not obtainable without first getting the odd ticket, which you needed to download from being online. I never knew about any of this as a kid and only vaguely heard about this within the last few years. Sorry to sound ageist again, but if you're younger than a millennial, this may not be as profound to you, but to us, the idea that you'd connect your Game Boy to a cell phone in 2001 would have been balked at. Look, I remember when Phantasy Star Online came out, and I couldn't believe there was an online capability for a console, let alone Game Boy Color. Absolutely no kid had a cell phone in America in 2001 unless your name was Richie Rich or something. Few adults even had cell phones then. In fact, I vividly remember family members still having pagers back then. Well, that was the case in Japan too. The mobile adapters would only sell 80,000 units in Japan. That wouldn't even come close to the millions of these they wanted to sell in order to create a healthy player base that would support a revolutionary new technology step for gaming. They tried slashing the price by almost half, but this still did nothing. This was a product marketed towards the Pokemon player base, which was mainly young children. The issue was that similar to American kids, Japanese kids didn't typically have cell phones at this time. Even today, it's rare for me to see a kid around age 7 or 8 have a cell phone, so it was even more abnormal back then. The mobile Game Boy adapter released in January of 2001 and failed pretty quickly. It gave Game Freak plenty of time to strip out those features from Pokemon Crystal's Western release in July. Some locations like the Battle Tower were made automatically accessible without the peripheral, same with being given the odd egg without needing the odd ticket. But other locations had to be entirely removed because they would only serve to confuse players, like the Pokemon Communication Center in Goldenrod City. But one thing that didn't make the cut to be natively accessible in-game was Celebi. Instead of making it readily available in-game since the online component was removed, they simply chose to copy the distribution method used with Mew in North America, meaning you'd need to show up to these one-time events in order to get Celebi legitimately. If you've seen my content before, you'll know I have a lot of respect for Nintendo and companies that work with them for always trying to take great leaps with technology. But it doesn't always work. I'm not the type of guy who mocks failures for trying to push the industry forward. I can say critical things, but that doesn't mean I criticize the attempt. Having internet and cell phone features on a Game Boy in 2000 was a massive risk that completely failed, but I respect the attempt. Almost 15 years later, Pokemon Crystal would be released on the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console. This would be the final core game brought back to the then current handhelds. It wasn't just a simple port either, it came with some heat. Like the other re-release games on the 3DS, you could trade between all those versions wirelessly local using your 3DS. You could transfer your Pokemon from Generation 1 and 2 games to the current games we play right now via the Poke Transporter. And the thing I always wished for as a kid, the 3DS release of Pokemon Crystal had the GS Ball event unlocked natively so that you could catch Celebi without needing to go to an in-person event. I was in heaven when this came out on 3DS. I even decided to shiny hunt Celebi. It took around 13,000 soft resets, which is 5,000 more attempts than its typical odds, but when it finally showed up, it was worth it. Look at that pink. I named it Punyon. Get it? It's pink, looks like an onion, and it's a pun. Punyon. Pokemon Crystal was better than people think. Yeah, it was the base game of Pokemon Gold and Silver, but its improvements are worthy of being remembered. Sprite animations alone changed how you viewed and felt about Pokemon. They had life, anatomy, personality. Even if you were familiar with them from previous games, you wanted to find new Pokemon just to see what the animation would look like. A feature that would disappear until Emerald. The story additions were fun, but actually ended up improving gameplay in a non-intrusive way. It made the wise choice to keep the 3 starting Pokemon rather than repeat what they did with Pokemon Yellow. We never got the online features in the West, and it definitely wouldn't have worked, but just the attempt is pretty incredible, even when looking at it in retrospect knowing it failed. Pokemon Crystal is awesome, and I'll be playing it long into the future. I think anyone watching who has never played it absolutely should. That's all I've got for Pokemon Crystal. Thank you for watching this far in. That alone helps a lot. If you'd like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe. It absolutely helps and is free. I'll be streaming my gameplay full-time on Twitch soon, so throw me a follow if you'd like to join me. I also have a Patreon. Supporting me on Patreon will help me make more content in the future and is where I like to post teasers, updates, and other behind-the-scenes extras. Thank you to my patron, Shio. Thank you again for watching. See you in the next video.